The night my sister sold our childhood home, I dreamt of our mother's voice calling me from the kitchen. It was one of those dreams that feels too real to shake off. I could almost smell the cardamom tea she used to make, hear the faint hum of her favorite old radio, and feel the floorboards creak under my bare feet as I ran to her. But when I woke up, there was only silence, the kind that presses down on your chest. The clock on my bedside table blinked 3:14 a.m. in the dark. I sat up, staring at the ceiling, wondering why that dream felt like a warning. My phone buzzed. A message from my neighbor back home. "Is everything okay? Saw a for sale sign in front of your house this evening." For a long moment, I couldn't move. The words didn't make sense. My house? The home where I grew up? I thought maybe they were mistaken. Maybe it was the wrong address, the wrong house. But when I opened the attached photo, there it was. Our faded yellow house, the one with the lilac tree Mama planted, standing behind a bright red sign that read, "Sold." And underneath that word, smaller letters I could barely process, "Pending closure this week." That's how the betrayal began. Quietly, in the middle of the night. No thunderclap, no warning, just silence and a sign. Before that night, life had been strangely peaceful. I had moved to the city after Mama passed, partly for work and partly because being in that house without her felt unbearable at first. My younger sister Laura had stayed behind. She said she wanted to look after Dad, who had become frail after the funeral. I admired her for that. Every few weekends, I'd drive the 2 hours back to visit. I'd bring groceries, fix leaky taps, tidy the garden, the same way Mama would have wanted. Our family wasn't rich, but that house. It was everything to us. Built by our grandfather after the war, it stood on a small piece of land near the edge of town, with white shutters and a porch that sagged slightly from age. Every inch of it held a story. The worn-out piano in the corner where Laura used to plunk at chopsticks until Mom shouted from the kitchen, "Play something pretty or stop altogether." The window seat where I read my first novel during a thunderstorm. Even the crack in the hallway wall, shaped oddly like a heart, that Dad promised to fix every summer, but never did. After Mom died, Dad mostly kept to himself. He'd sit by the window, staring into the garden where she used to grow marigolds. Some evenings he'd talk to her picture, and Laura, she became his shadow. She cooked for him, managed the bills, talked to the neighbors, handled visitors. I was proud of her, though I felt guilty for leaving. She'd always been the gentle one, quiet, soft-spoken, the kind of girl who hated conflict. We were different that way. I was the planner, the responsible one, the older sister in every sense. When Mom got sick, I was the one who took her to her chemotherapy sessions. I was the one who handled the insurance paperwork. And when she passed, I was the one who arranged the funeral. Laura had cried on my shoulder the entire time. So when she offered to stay behind with Dad, I said yes. I thought she needed that, to feel close to them. We never discussed the house formally. It was simply ours. Mama used to say, "When I'm gone, I want you two to keep this place alive. It's the only legacy I can leave behind." I promised her I would. I think Laura did too, at least back then. Life rolled on. Work kept me busy. Long hours, deadlines, meetings that left me drained. But every time I drove back to that small town and turned onto Maple Lane, my chest felt lighter. The moment I'd step through that creaky front door, I'd smell the faint mix of lavender and floor polish. Laura would call from the kitchen, "You made it!" I was just baking something. And Dad would smile, that soft, tired smile that made me forget how hard grief had hit us. We'd sit around the dinner table, sharing stories, laughing at old memories. For a while, it felt like we were healing. That's why the night I got that text felt impossible. Because betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the people you trust the most. A few months before the sale, I did notice something. Small. Something I brushed off too easily. One evening when I called Dad, his tone was distant. He said, "Laura's handling everything now. You don't need to worry about the bills anymore." That struck me as odd because I had been helping with the bills, sending money each month for maintenance and utilities. I asked him if something was wrong. He hesitated. No. Your sister's just making things easier for me." I didn't question it further. Maybe he was tired. Maybe Laura had finally taken charge. But later, when I texted Laura, she replied hours later, saying, "Yeah, I've got things covered. Focus on your work." The words felt cold, like a door slowly closing. Another time, during a visit, I noticed Dad's nameplate missing from his study door. When I asked, Laura said she'd moved his papers to a safer place. The room looked strangely bare, the old filing cabinet gone, his briefcase missing. I remember her saying, "Don't worry about it. You always worry too much." And then she smiled that small, disarming smile that used to melt all my suspicion when we were kids. But the warmth between us had shifted. It was like we were living parallel lives, sharing the same memories, but walking in different directions. Dad passed away not long after that, peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was quiet. Neighbors came. The pastor spoke softly about a life of quiet strength. Laura barely spoke to me that day. She looked hollowed out, or maybe I just told myself that to excuse her silence. Afterward, I asked about Dad's will. She said there wasn't much left to divide. You know how things were. I believed her. Because she was my sister. Because I wanted to believe her. If I had looked closer then, I might have noticed the missing mail on the side table, the legal envelopes that used to come every month. But grief makes fools of us. And so, I went back to my city life, assuming the home would remain where it always had, waiting, untouched, like an anchor to everything we once were, until that 3 a.m. message shattered it all. When I called Laura the next morning, she didn't answer. I tried again and again. Finally, she picked up, her voice groggy. "Why are you calling so early?" she murmured. I didn't bother with greetings. "Laura, is there a for sale sign in front of the house?" A pause, then too casually. "Oh, yeah, about that." I felt something inside me go still. "What do you mean about that?" She sighed like I was inconveniencing her. "Look, it's complicated, okay? Dad signed over the deed to me before he passed." "I thought you knew." The words hit me like a blow. My hand trembled so hard I almost dropped the phone. "He did what? When?" "Months ago," she said. "He wanted to simplify things." It was his decision. I couldn't breathe. That house was supposed to be ours. Mom wanted— I know what Mom wanted, she snapped suddenly. But she's gone, and we needed to move on. I couldn't afford to keep the place. The roof leaks, the taxes are high. It's not worth fighting over. Fighting. She said it like I'd already started a war. I whispered, "You sold it without telling me." Another pause. Then a quiet, unapologetic answer. Yes. That was the moment I realized grief hadn't ended our family. Greed had. I didn't know what I was feeling at that moment. Anger, betrayal, confusion, heartbreak. It was all tangled together in a knot I couldn't untie. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what she'd just said. But no matter how many times I replayed the conversation in my head, the words didn't change. She sold the house, our house. The tears came, but not for the reasons I expected. I didn't cry because of the house itself, but because I realized my sister, the one I thought I could trust with anything, had taken something from me that I would never get back. Not just the house, but the memory of it, the meaning it held. It was all tainted now. I sat on my bed, staring out the window, feeling that familiar ache in my chest. The one I'd felt when I lost Mama, and then again when I lost Dad. But this was different. This was a betrayal I hadn't seen coming. I remember hanging up the phone with Laura, the weight of her words still pressing down on me. I sat there, staring at the empty room for what felt like hours, my fingers cold against the phone. Eventually, I stood up and paced the room, not sure what to do next. I had to see it for myself. I had to stand in front of that house and let the reality of it sink in. The drive felt longer than it should have. The familiar streets that I once knew like the back of my hand now seemed distant, like I was driving through someone else's life. By the time I pulled up to the house, it was dusk, the kind of twilight where the shadows stretch longer and the world feels quiet. The first thing I saw was that damn sign. It stood tall, a bright red beacon that made my heart drop into my stomach. I parked and walked up the driveway, my shoes crunching the gravel beneath me. The lilac tree, once full of blooms, was now bare, its branches heavy with the weight of the seasons it had seen. The porch looked neglected, as though no one had bothered to sweep in weeks. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt empty. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, trying to collect my thoughts. The memories were so thick around me. Mama's laughter in the kitchen, Dad's voice echoing from his study, Laura and I running down the hall to avoid our chores. But none of it mattered now. Not when I felt like I'd been left out of something so deeply personal. "Is everything okay?" a voice called from behind me. I turned, startled. It was Mrs. Hollis, the neighbor who lived across the street. She'd always been a kind woman, always bringing over pies at Christmas and tending to the flowers in her garden with Mama. I don't know, I replied, my voice shaky. I can't believe it's really gone. She nodded, her eyes sympathetic. I know. I thought someone from your family was taking care of the place. Your sister. She trailed off, her voice soft. She didn't tell you, did she? I shook my head, feeling the sting of those words. No, she didn't tell me anything. Not about the house. Not about anything. Mrs. Hollis sighed, her hands folding in front of her. She told me she had to sell it. Said the bills were too much. But I don't know. Something didn't sit right with me. I didn't think she'd go through with it. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice growing steadier, but the hurt was still there. I tried, dear, but Laura asked me not to. I thought you were in the city. Thought you'd want to be left out of it. A laugh escaped me, hollow and bitter. Well, I'd certainly like to have been left out of it, but not like this. I felt like I was suffocating. This wasn't the family I grew up in. This wasn't the sister I had loved and trusted. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I knew I had to confront Laura. I had to hear her say it, face to face. I needed to know why she'd done this to me, to us. The next day, I drove to Laura's apartment, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts I couldn't keep in check. When I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I fumbled with my phone and sent her a message. "Where are you? We need to talk." It wasn't long before she finally responded. "I'm busy. Can we do this later?" I didn't wait for a reply. I shoved the phone in my pocket and turned the doorknob. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside. Her apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. The air was stale, and the soft scent of lavender lingered in the air, the same scent she used to wear when we were younger. I found her in the kitchen, her back to me, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. Her shoulders stiffened as I entered. "You sold the house," I said, my voice low but steady. She didn't turn around. "I told you. It was for the best." "For who, Laura?" "For you." She stood up slowly and turned to face me. Her eyes were dull, tired. There was something hollow in her gaze, something I hadn't seen in years. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't keep it. "You don't understand. You never understood how much it cost me to stay there after Dad died. You don't get it, do you?" I said, feeling the anger rise in my chest. "This isn't about money, Laura. It's about family. It's about honoring Mom and Dad. That house was ours, not just yours." She sighed, rubbing her temples as if I were giving her a headache. "I was trying to protect you, protect us. I knew you'd never agree to sell it, so I took care of it for both of us." I couldn't breathe. You didn't take care of anything. You stole it from me. You made this decision without me, and now I have nothing. She winced, her face contorting with guilt. I didn't want to hurt you. I never meant to, but we can't keep holding on to the past forever. And what about me, Laura? What about everything we've lost? She turned away from me, her voice quieter now. I'm sorry, but it's done. It's over. The words felt like a final nail in the coffin, but I couldn't leave it like that. Not yet. I'll never forgive you for this, I said, my voice sharp. You've taken more than just the house. You've taken my family's legacy. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough. I didn't expect Laura to beg for forgiveness, but I certainly didn't expect her to be so calm about it. So detached, like she'd already moved on from what she'd done. It angered me, but it also gave me a strange clarity. She'd made her choice. She was done. But I wasn't. I spent the next few days in a haze. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that red "sold" sign. It haunted me, taunted me. It was as if the house, our home, was slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But I wasn't going to let it go that easily. That house was more than just walls and floors. It was our childhood, our memories, our legacy, and I wasn't going to let my sister wipe all of that away without a fight. I started making calls. I contacted the real estate agent who handled the sale. I asked questions. I demanded answers. He was polite, but the message was clear. Nothing can be undone. The deal's closed. The paperwork's been filed, but I wasn't ready to accept that. I knew there had to be something I could do, so I began looking into the legalities of it all. I called a lawyer, someone who could advise me on whether the sale was truly final, or if there was any hope of reclaiming the house. I didn't know where to start, but I knew I had to try. The lawyer explained the situation calmly, but it was like a cold splash of water to my face. The deed transfer was legal, he said, his voice flat. If your father signed it willingly, and you weren't listed as a beneficiary in the will, then your sister legally owns the property. You'd need solid grounds for a claim to overturn it. I felt the weight of his words, but I wasn't ready to give up just yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, replaying every conversation, every moment leading up to this. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something. My sister hadn't just sold the house. She had used our father's fragile state to convince him to sign over the deed. He wasn't in a position to understand the implications of what he was doing. She had taken advantage of that. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about the principle. I remembered a conversation I'd overheard a year ago when Dad had still been alive, sitting in the living room while Laura and I were talking in the kitchen. Your dad's getting old, Laura had said softly, more to herself than to me. He doesn't know what's best for him anymore. I have to make these decisions for him. I'd brushed it off at the time, but now it felt like a chilling premonition. She'd been planning this all along. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It wasn't even about Laura. It was about me reclaiming something I had lost. My sense of justice. My belief that family should never betray each other this way. I started digging through old family documents, trying to piece together every detail of Dad's will, every signed paper, every whisper from neighbors and friends. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that I had been blind. I trusted Laura. I assumed the best of her. I thought we had an unspoken bond that couldn't be broken, but I was wrong. I spent the next few days reaching out to more lawyers. I wasn't giving up. I couldn't. One afternoon, I received a call back from a local lawyer who specialized in estate law. He had a piece of information that made my stomach drop. The will was never properly executed. There's a chance the transfer of the house could be contested on the grounds of your father's diminished mental capacity at the time. I sat up straighter. Diminished mental capacity? What do you mean? Your father was in and out of health issues in his final years. If it can be proven that he wasn't fully aware of what he was signing, There's a chance the deed transfer could be reversed. I was both relieved and terrified. This could be my chance to get the house back, but it also meant dragging up everything that had happened, reopening old wounds. But for the first time in days, I felt like I had a purpose. Like I could win this battle not just for myself, but for Dad's memory. I spent the next few weeks gathering evidence, speaking with doctors who had treated Dad, and even talking to family friends who could attest to his mental state in the months leading up to his death. It wasn't easy. The more I dug, the more it felt like I was chasing shadows, like I was fighting a battle that was already lost, but I couldn't let go. Then came the day of the court hearing. The day I would face Laura in front of a judge, armed with everything I had. I knew I couldn't let my emotions get the best of me. I couldn't let her see how hurt I was. This was no longer about family. It was about justice. As we sat across from each other in the courtroom, I could feel the tension between us, thick and suffocating. Laura looked different. There was a coldness in her eyes that I had never seen before. "I never wanted this, you know," she said softly, her voice betraying no emotion. "But I had to do what was best for me. For us." "You didn't do it for us," I shot back, my voice shaking. "You did it for yourself." The judge listened quietly as our lawyers presented their arguments. The evidence I had gathered, the testimonies from those who had witnessed Dad's decline, were enough to convince the judge to delay the final transfer of ownership. But it was still uncertain. We had to wait for further deliberation. After the hearing, Laura and I stood there in silence, facing each other. "You should have trusted me," she finally said, her voice distant. "I did trust you," I replied, my voice breaking. "And that's why it hurts so much." The waiting was the hardest part. I felt like I was suspended in time, caught between the past and the future. My mind would wander back to that house, to the kitchen where we'd once laughed, to the garden where we'd planted flowers for Mama. It didn't matter that the house had changed hands. It didn't matter what Laura had done. What mattered was reclaiming my peace, my family's memory. Weeks later, the court ruled in my favor. The deed transfer was voided. The house was officially returned to the family, but it wasn't a victory I could celebrate. The damage had been done. I wasn't sure if Laura and I could ever repair what had been broken. The news hit like a quiet storm, sweeping through our small town in the way local gossip always does. The judge's decision to return the house to our family wasn't just a legal victory. It was a public spectacle. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors now felt emboldened to share their opinions. I didn't care about the whispers. I didn't care about the judgment of people who didn't know the whole story. What mattered was the house, and what mattered was healing the pieces of myself I hadn't even realized were broken. But the public consequences of the legal battle weren't easy to ignore. It spread like wildfire. Laura, who had once been the quiet one, now had a target on her back. I could see it in the way people looked at her when she went to the grocery store. I could hear it in the murmur of conversations whenever she passed by. There were no grand speeches, no grandiose declarations of victory. But the weight of the world had shifted, and it felt like everyone knew it. The house was back in our family's hands, but it wasn't the same. It could never be the same. It didn't take long before people started reaching out to me. A few of Dad's old friends called, expressing their relief that the house had been saved. Some of the neighbors sent cards, apologizing for not having said more when things had first gone down. It was all so strange. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. People seemed to care more about the house itself than about what had actually happened to tear the family apart. But there was one conversation I couldn't avoid. One person who would never let me forget what had happened. The phone rang late one night, just as I was about to turn in for the evening. It was a familiar number, Laura. I stared at the screen for a moment, my heart pounding before I answered. "Hello?" I said, my voice cautious. Are you happy now? Laura's voice crackled through the line, tight and cold. I hesitated. What do you mean? Is this what you wanted? For everyone to know how I betrayed you? She spat. Do you think the people here know the whole story? Do you think they understand what it's like to have to fight for everything? Her words were like daggers, sharp and cutting. I could hear the bitterness, the resentment, the same resentment I had heard when we'd fought in the courtroom. You should have trusted me, she continued, her voice shaking with anger. You should have let me do what I needed to do. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who looked after Dad. You don't know what it was like for me. You don't know how hard it was. I could hear the desperation in her voice, the fear she hadn't let herself express until now. But it wasn't about the house anymore. It wasn't about who did or didn't stay. It was about a fundamental fracture that had grown too large to ignore. You chose this, Laura, I said, my voice quiet but firm. You chose to take the house. You chose to keep me out. And now you're angry because I'm standing up for what's right? She didn't answer. Instead, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, shaky and uneven. I never wanted it to be like this, she whispered finally. Her voice breaking. You made it like this, I said softly. My throat tightening. There was no response. Just the sound of the line going dead. In the days following that call, Laura withdrew from everyone. She stopped answering calls. She avoided our childhood friends and neighbors. I knew what people were saying about her. I could hear it when I ran into old acquaintances. They'd glance at me, then look away. Some of them even started to make excuses for her, telling me I was too harsh on my sister. Family's family, they'd say. She was only doing what she thought was best. But none of them really knew what it felt like. None of them had been there in the late hours, when Laura quietly signed papers, when she sold the house behind my back. They hadn't seen the look on my father's face when I showed him the deed transfer paperwork days before he passed, his eyes wide with confusion. The truth is, I didn't care if people thought I was being too harsh. I cared about what was right, not what was easy. Laura wasn't the only one who had to deal with the fallout of the decision. I could feel my own reputation shifting. It was subtle at first, but the cracks started to show. People whispered about me too. People who knew our family, who had seen us grow up together, now looked at me with a mix of pity and curiosity. But I didn't care about the judgment anymore. I only cared about fixing what was broken. I didn't expect forgiveness to come easily. But the reality was even more painful than I imagined. I knew that Laura and I were never going to be the same. The trust was gone. The foundation we had built together had been cracked beyond repair. But I couldn't keep running from it. I couldn't keep carrying this bitterness in my heart. I had to find a way to heal. I started small. I visited the house again, this time without the expectation of reclaiming anything. Not the past, not the memories, not the people we used to be. I walked through the rooms slowly, taking in the details that hadn't changed. The old piano was still there. The garden was still there, though a little wilder than I remembered. The lilac tree, though bare, was still standing tall. And in that quiet space, I found something I hadn't expected. Peace. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a quiet understanding that the past could never be fully reclaimed, and that I didn't need to keep fighting to hold on to it. I could rebuild something new. After everything had settled, I finally reached out to Laura again. This time it wasn't to fight. It was to talk, to understand, to heal, if possible. She agreed to meet at a coffee shop. When I saw her sitting there, her posture was slumped, her eyes tired, the same weariness in her expression that I had seen in the final months of our father's life. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said quietly as I sat down. "But I am sorry. I was selfish, and I should have told you." I looked at her for a long time, the weight of everything we had lost hanging between us. I couldn't erase the hurt. I couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. but I could hear the sincerity in her voice, the rawness. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt the tiniest crack in the wall that had been built between us. "Maybe one day we'll get back to what we were," I said softly. "Maybe not, but I'm not holding on to this anger anymore, Laura. I'm not carrying it with me." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. The months following our meeting felt like slow, hesitant steps toward something I wasn't sure I could name. There was no dramatic moment of reconciliation, no big heartfelt hug that would tie up the loose ends of a lifetime of history. But there was something softer, a shift. A kind of quiet understanding that neither of us could undo the past, but we could, in time, reshape what our relationship could be. After that conversation at the coffee shop, I didn't push Laura. I didn't try to force a perfect apology or a reunion. I gave her space, and I gave myself space too. But every now and then, we'd send each other a message. A simple, "How are you?" or "I was thinking about you." Small things, but important. The house sat there, still standing, still holding the weight of everything that had happened. But I found myself visiting it less and less. Not because I didn't care, but because I realized something important. I didn't need the house to hold on to the memories. I carried them with me, in my heart, in my mind. I focused on rebuilding my own life, piece by piece. I spent more time with friends, finally letting myself laugh without guilt, and I started to embrace the small joys again. I traveled. I learned how to cook the way Mom used to. I even started volunteering at the local community center, working with kids, something I never thought I'd have the patience for. But through it all, there was always a quiet thought in the back of my mind, the thought of the house, of Laura, and of the family I once knew. Laura reached out to me one summer evening. I was sitting on my balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, when I saw her name pop up on my phone. My heart skipped a beat. After all this time, I hadn't heard from her much. She wasn't the type to call just to check in. "Hey," the text read, "I'm in town. Would you like to meet?" For a moment I hesitated. I had learned that healing wasn't always linear. Some days were good, others were hard. But something in her message felt different. It didn't feel like a request for forgiveness. It didn't feel like an apology. It just felt human. I typed back, "Sure, let's meet at the park." When I arrived, I saw her sitting on one of the old wooden benches near the pond, the same one we used to sit on when we were kids. She looked older. There were lines around her eyes, and her hair was longer, streaked with gray. But there was also a kind of peace in her face, something I hadn't seen in years. I sat next to her, the bench creaking under the weight of both our pasts. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The silence between us was comfortable, not uncomfortable. There was no need for words just yet. Finally, Laura spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "I'm sorry, you know. I should have never done what I did. I thought I was protecting us, but I was just protecting myself. I was scared of losing everything, and I ended up losing you instead." Her words were simple, but they held so much. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about the sister I had once known, the one who had been my best friend before life and distance had pulled us apart. "I know you were scared," I said softly. "I know you didn't mean for any of this to happen, but that doesn't make it right." "I know," she whispered. "I was selfish. I thought I had to do it alone, but I don't. I didn't." For the first time in a long while, I felt a weight lift. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement of the pain we had both caused, a recognition of the brokenness we had both been carrying. I took a deep breath, looking out at the water. "Maybe one day I'll be able to forgive you, Laura. Maybe not. But right now, I'm just glad you're here." She nodded, a small tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, and for that moment, I realized that this was enough. It wasn't about closing the door on everything that had happened. It was about opening a window, one small crack, to allow light back in. In the weeks that followed, we kept meeting. In the park, at the coffee shop, sometimes just walking around town, taking things slow. It wasn't easy. There were moments when old wounds would resurface, when the anger I had pushed down would bubble up again. But each time, I allowed myself to feel it, to release it, instead of holding it in. I kept the house. It wasn't a grand gesture. I didn't throw a housewarming party or boast about winning the house back. No, I simply moved in. I fixed the roof. I tended the garden. I painted the walls a soft shade of blue that reminded me of calm summer skies. I filled the house with new memories, new life. I didn't need to erase the old ones. They would always be there, woven into the fabric of this place. But I could choose how I wanted to live here now. I could choose peace over anger, healing over resentment, and so, day by day, I rebuilt. Not just the house, but the legacy I wanted to leave behind. A legacy of strength, of forgiveness, of understanding that family is messy, complicated, and imperfect, but still worth fighting for. The last conversation I had with Laura, before everything felt like it had truly started to heal, was simple. We sat in the living room of that house, the one we had once fought over. The smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly, her eyes not meeting mine. I looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "For fixing it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For taking it back, for making it yours again." I smiled softly. "I couldn't do it alone, Laura. Not then. And not now." She finally met my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something I hadn't seen in her for years. Hope. As I sit here now, in the quiet of the house that's once again a home, I can't help but reflect on how far we've come. I've learned that family isn't perfect. It's flawed and messy, and sometimes it feels like it's falling apart. But it's also the place where we find healing, if we let ourselves. I've learned that there's power in forgiveness, but there's also power in knowing when to walk away, to stand up for yourself, and to say, "This is mine, and I will protect it." But most of all, I've learned that it's never too late to rebuild. The house may have been sold, but the home, the real home, is built on love, understanding, and the strength to keep going even when it feels impossible. And so I ask you, dear listener, have you ever had to fight for something you believed in? Something that was taken from you without your consent? How did you find the strength to keep going? Tell me your story in the comments below. And remember, no matter where life takes you, you have the power to rebuild. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and join me again next time for another story of resilience and hope.